Mr Speaker.
I'm calling Sue Moroney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a pleasure to take a call in this debate about whether or not we should have a by-election in Epsom, given the resignation of John Banks. And I think it's all about timing, really, isn't it? This debate is all about timing, because when these allegations first came to light, if the police had prosecuted at that point, then we wouldn't be having a debate about whether to have a by-election or not. We would definitely be having one, because it would have been around about 2 years ago that this would have all occurred. And then we would have had the prospect of trying to find out whether the National Party was going to stand a bag of flour, or whether they were going to stand a candidate, or in fact what they would do in the case of a by-election for Epsom. And because the police chose not to, or made a decision not to prosecute Mr Banks at that time, we are instead here having this debate on this day, where all the parties are agreeing that it actually wouldn't be a good idea to have a by-election, even though the disgraced MP has resigned, because of the timing of this now. We're running hard up against a general election, and everyone, I think, that I've heard speak so far in the debate has seen the logic of not having a by-election at this particular point in time. But I think there are questions that remain around why that prosecution didn't happen 2 years ago when it should have, because my colleague Annette King is quite right. There are a number of pieces of legislation that have been to the detriment of the New Zealand public that would not have passed if John Banks's vote hadn't been used to prop up those pieces of legislation. Pieces of legislation that have not found favour with the public, like the sale of our state-owned assets, pieces of legislation like charter schools, and just hearing Annette King speak about that reminded me that, of course, at the time when the charter schools legislation went through, supported by John Banks's one vote, that we didn't, that the government wasn't really very upfront at that time and didn't tell us that, of course, the students going to these charter schools would be funded at a much higher rate than children who are going through our state schooling system. And I wonder, had John Banks known that, or perhaps he did, if he had known that, whether he would have voted for that legislation, and it may not have gone through anyway. But Mr Speaker, here we are, some 18 months or 2 years on from when this debate could have been held about a by-election in Epsom, when it would have been in a suitable time frame for exactly that course of action to be taken. Many pieces of dreadful legislation later propped up by John Banks, who has now departed this place. And we are all saying that having a by-election wouldn't be in the best interest of the public purse, of the public spend, because we've got an election coming up. However, in the meantime, quite a lot of damage has been done by a vote that should never have been able to have been used, Mr Speaker. And I think that's the thing that causes me grief for democratic principles. And what we've been talking about on this side of the House is that it was plain to us 2 years ago that this action should have been taken. And I think it was plain to the National Party at that time as well. Because I can see now, in hindsight, exactly why the Prime Minister chose the election date of the 20th of September. It was earlier than many people were expecting. But of course, the Prime Minister, in hindsight, I believe, chose that date knowing that John Banks would be found guilty, would in fact be prosecuted, and therefore would have to leave as a Member of Parliament. And so I find that a deeply cynical thing for the government, for the Prime Minister to have done, to have been, I think now, so certain that John Banks was in fact guilty of what he'd been accused of, to be so certain of it that I believe the election timetable has been set around that certainty. And if I'm right, and if the Prime Minister was certain that that was going to be the outcome of the court case, then why didn't he do what he should have done all along and actually acted on the information that he had? Why did the Prime Minister sit it out, wait it out for around 2 years, knowing what he knew, and wait for a court to make that decision? And, Mr Speaker, I just want to place on record my view that the Prime Minister did in fact know, that he did in fact know exactly the finding that the court would come to. Because why else? What other explanation do we have for a September 20th election date? How could he know it? Well, Ian McKelvey asked, how could the Prime Minister know that? Well, just use your imagination, Mr McKelvey. The Prime Minister kept saying over and over again that he took Mr Banks at his word. And yet, once he knew that John Banks was going in front of a court of law, then he set about choosing an election timetable that would have us having this debate around about this time, with parties conceding that actually having a by-election at this point, so close to a general election, probably isn't the best use of taxpayer funding. And I think that the timing of that has been quite deliberate. So I'm concerned about that, but I'm also concerned about how that vote, that one vote, and I think now New Zealanders can look at this and go, gosh, actually this government is hanging on by a thread. Absolutely hanging on by a thread. And you know how they know that, Mr Speaker? It's because members of the public now know that the government hasn't got the votes to put through some legislation it dearly wants to put through. And I want to speak about one of those pieces of legislation because it's a piece that's very dear to my heart, and that is the legislation that the government has in front of this House to take away the legal right to have a tea break at work. It's very dear to my heart because actually I wrote that piece of legislation. It was a members' bill that I had in my name when I came in my first term in 2005. Fortunately, it was a Labour-led government, and the Labour-led government chose to take my members' bill up as a government bill. Actually added a little bit more onto it around breastfeeding breaks at work as well. But up until that point, I think it finally got passed in about 2007, there was no legal right for people to have a tea break or a lunch break or a meal break at work. If they had it in their employment agreement, it was a legal right for them, but if their collective employment agreement was silent, then they didn't have that right. So that law was passed in 2007 by Labour, and that's the piece of law, that's part of the piece of law that the government now can't pass, thank goodness, because John Banks is no longer here to prop up that very, very bad piece of industrial legislation, of employment legislation. Of course, it does other very bad things as well, like take away the ability for people to get a decent pay rise by ensuring that employers don't have to negotiate and don't have to conclude a collective employment agreement. Does all sorts of terrible things for working people. But I'm really pleased that that one vote will no longer be used to take away people's legal right to have a break at work. So I'm very pleased in some ways that the government no longer has that very, what would I call it? I can't use the word I really want to use, but the mandate that they've used, the one vote that they've used to put all sorts of other dreadful laws through, they should never have had the right to have used that vote. Because this debate has been going on for a couple of years now about whether John Banks knew what he knew, whether he did what he was accused of doing. And I think the National Party knew all the way along that he was in fact guilty, as the court has found him, and they should never have been using his vote to prop up the very bad legislation that they've been putting through in that time. Mr Speaker, it is a sad day for Parliament because one of our own has had to resign. He's had to resign because, in fact, when he's found guilty of a charge such as the one he's been found guilty of, then he had no choice but to resign. The only thing that he had a choice about was the timing of that resignation. And the timing of this debate, Mr Speaker, I think has been constructed for some time. Thank you.
Members, this debate is concluded. The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Members, the time has come for me to leave the chair for the dinner break. I shall resume the chair at 7:30.